Hey there, art nerds! So I have another start to finish watercolor tutorial for you guys. This is the only one, I believe, from 2025, and we are doing a tiny, adorable, wintry house. I am completing this start to finish in my Canson XL watercolor sketchbook, and I am starting out by using red lead to subdivide the page in half from top to bottom, from side to side, and then I'm subdividing those in half as well to create a grid. In the center of the paper, I have sketched a round Hobbit style door. This is going to be a double door, so it is split in half, and I apologize, it is super hard to see, and part of that is because I am sketching extremely lightly, and one of the reasons I am doing that is because I want to be able to erase this if I make mistakes. I am using red lead because I don't have to actually fully erase it. I can leave it on the paper and then watercolor on top of it, and the red lead will basically disappear. But if you are drawing along with me today, you can use whatever materials make your heart sing, and I'll have a list of the materials down in the description below if you want to use what I'm using or see if you've got similar. So I have our little round double door sketched out. It has a circular window in the upper half. It has a circular doorknob on the bottom half. It has a wreath going around it with a large ribbon. And now I am sketching out what is going to be a pine cone Christmas tree. And this is something that you guys have seen me draw in the past. In fact, last year's Christmas start to finish had a similar pine cone Christmas tree. I just think it's a really adorable sort of thing, a little detail for my tiny people and tiny animals illustrations. So now that I have things basically kind of plotted out, I'm going to add in some more details. I'm adding in the sides of the tree. I'm also adding in an arched window above our door. I'm adding in some loose piles of snow as well as some pebbles leading up to the door and leading up to the present on the door. So with this illustration, my original thumbnail sketch actually had the double door with the top open, and I decided that for storytelling purposes I was going to have both halves of the door shut, although that makes it harder to tell that it is a double door, and I was going to have a present left on the stoop as though someone had left a present for the family overnight or perhaps while they were gone. Now once I have my sketch to my liking, I'm going to go in and refine the details by drawing in just a little bit heavier with our red lead. That makes it easier for you guys to see. It makes it easier for me to see, but it is not necessary. If you don't want to do this step, you do not have to do this step. You can go straight into inking if you wish. So when I was holding my mechanical pencil originally, you might have noticed that the grip was kind of strange. I was holding it very lightly and towards the top, and I find that this is easier on my hands, on my wrists, for just kind of loose sketching. For tighter, more detailed sketching like this, I am actually much tighter up on my mechanical pencil, and I have a comfort grip on there because I do have some hand health and some grip and mobility issues, and I find that utilizing grips makes it a lot easier for me to do what I do. If you also have similar issues, whether you struggle to hold a pencil or you deal with hand fatigue or joint pain, I actually have a video where I talk about different grips that I have found or have been recommended to me during occupational therapy that you guys might find helpful, because a few years ago I ran a poll asking people what they used when I first started to have when these problems became just debilitating. I've had arthritis in my hands since I was 12, but when these problems started to really affect my life, I asked people what they were using, and so many people told me, I don't know, let me know what you find out, that I decided to make a video about it, and I'll link it for you guys down in the description. So with our adorable pine cone Christmas tree, I am decorating it with, okay, so this little house is in an oak tree inspired by the Spanish oak trees that are in my front yard. In fact, I'm going to be using a photo of the bark as my reference when painting the bark. And when it comes to our oak trees, the squirrels in our neighborhood love our oak trees. They are full of squirrels, and they love the acorns from our oak trees. But beneath our oak trees, we're always finding these massive pine cones. And that's because the squirrels will bring their lunch with them to come eat in our trees. So this illustration was kind of inspired by the oak trees, the squirrels, and the pine cones in our yard. So I decorated our little miniature Christmas tree with acorns, with little bells, and with little red beads. And then there is a little wooden angel on top. But if you are drawing along with me, please feel free to take inspiration inspiration to add your own touches, to add your own adjustments, to add your own personality to this illustration. This is not me telling you what to do and how to do it. This is me hopefully inspiring you to pick up a pencil and to make some art, and to make art accessible, and to make art a daily part of your life, and to make art a habit. This is also my way of pushing back against the garbage that is generative AI, which, if you don't know, I hate it. I think it's the scourge of the earth, and I don't want to see it. And I have been making art accessible by creating art tutorials for over a decade now. And I myself am a disabled artist. I have ADHD. I have high anxiety. Can you tell? And I also have Sjogren's syndrome, which has really started to degrade my joints. So if somebody like me can be an artist, I fully believe that anybody who wants to learn how to draw, how to paint, how to make art, can make art themselves, can become an artist themselves. And I really want to help make traditional art, like what I'm doing here, drawing with a pencil. I'm going to ink it with a brush pen, and then I'm going to watercolor it. I want to make that more accessible to more people. So I have a lot of tutorials and reviews here on the channel, have done so for years, to make that goal a reality and to make this as accessible to as many people as possible. So I'm just kind of tightening up my red lead sketch so that you guys can see it a little bit better, adding in my final details, and then I am going to ink it with a Tombow, nope, not a Tombow, a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. Now, surprise, surprise, this is actually the second time I did the narration. My editing app crashed when I was 4 minutes from being finished. So I'm gonna do my best to have the same Genki energy for you guys and to walk you guys through the process. But if you ever have any questions about how I do something or why I do something, feel free to let me know in the comments below, or to join me on my art-centric Discord server, The Paintbox. And I'll try to remember to have a link for you guys down in the description, along with other tutorials that you guys might find helpful, useful, and informative, as well as tutorials that will inspire you to draw, to paint, to watercolor, and to ink. So I am working with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. This is a waterproof and alcohol marker safe brush pen. So that means I can do watercolor on top of it. I can do acrylics on top of it. I could do gouache on top of it if I want to, or I could use alcohol markers on top of it. If you would like to do a colored line art, Tombow, there we go. Tombow makes the Tombow Furunosuke brush pens that come in a variety of colors. I also really like those. And if you've watched the channel for a while, you've probably seen me use those as well. I particularly like using those with alcohol markers for fun line art. Speaking of line art, if you do not feel like drawing and inking this, if you just want to color along, I will have a link to the line art down in the description below. Now, generally, I only share the line arts with my patrons over on Patreon. That is a Patreon perk to thank them for their financial support, because without them, I cannot do this. So their support is hugely necessary, and it is becoming increasingly necessary. However, it is December, and I wanted to share this and to encourage more people to make art and to make the world a more joyful place. So all of my printables for December are free over on my Patreon. You do not need to be a patron to access them, to print them, to be able to use them. So there is the line art for this tutorial. There is the line art and printables for my papercraft angel ornament. And there is also the materials, the templates that you need for 2 different card tutorials that make 3 different cards total. So you can find all of that over at patreon.com/nattasoup, and all of those will be free. I will also have it linked for you guys down in the description. So when inking with a brush pen, I like brush pens because you basically get a variety of line widths. That is the width of the line that you are using to ink, if that makes sense. You get a variety of line widths in just one pen, but you could use fine liners for this. Any waterproof, water safe marker, drawing material pen will work just fine for this. I also want to point out that this is one of my longer start to finish tutorials. It has been time-lapsed. The sketch was time-lapsed by 4. The inking was time-lapsed by 8. The painting was time-lapsed by 8, anywhere from 8 to 10x. So It did take me several days to paint this, and part of that was watercolor just takes time. Drawing things just takes time. There's a lot of wet and wet techniques that I use for this. Allowing the inks to cure to the paper takes time. But also, I am a busy adult with a lot of different obligations, and it is the holidays, so I am teaching classes and visiting with family and purchasing presents and just generally working my other life. So please do not think that you should be able to finish this illustration in just one sitting. That is ridiculous. That's not reality. Also, please know that I am heavily using reference photos every step of the way. Now, you guys saw me sketch this out in front of you, even when it was overexposed and overblown. You saw me sketch it. There is nothing wrong with using reference when you're drawing. It does not make you less of an artist. I encourage you to use reference, because even if you think you have a good idea of what things look like in your head, it's good to work with both. So I encourage you to use reference, and I used reference for the tree. I used reference for the pine cone. I used reference for the fir wreath. Please use reference. So I am using my Daily Driver watercolor palette for this. You could use a palette as small as 8 to 12 colors if you feel like doing a lot of color mixing. There's nothing wrong with that. Getting familiar with your watercolors is a wonderful goal for 2026. I am using a convenience palette full of pre-mixed colors and colors that I can kind of customize and mix, because I am a watercolor comic artist. I make the watercolor comic 7-inch Cara, and when you're painting hundreds of comic panels and hundreds of comic pages, convenience colors are your friends. But please do not think you need to start out with a palette this large. That said, if you would like to work with a lot of pre-mixed, ready-to-go colors, I highly recommend the Mei Liang Pigments 48 color set. That is a great place to start when it comes to having some convenience colors already handy. So I started out by painting kind of a round vignette around the tree using cerulean blue mixed with a little bit of cobalt blue to give us that really nice bright winter sky color. I used ultramarine blue to paint the shadow on our snow. I custom mixed different grays for the pebbles in the foreground. Some of them are more gray, some of them are more blue, some of them are more brown. I'm going for some color variation there. And then for the bark of the tree, we are starting with this custom mix of gray. It contains ultramarine blue, it contains Van Dyke blue and Van Dyke brown, sorry, and maybe a little bit of sepia in there, as well as probably a little bit of burnt umber. While the bark is still wet, I am dabbing in some of Daniel Smith's Undersea Green, and this is to kind of replicate the moss and the lichen that I noticed in my photo reference, and that I want to make sure to capture because I love moss and lichen. So even though my art has a distinctly cartoony bent, I do have an MFA, a Master of Fine Art in Sequential Art. That would be comics from SCAD. So of course, you know, I love cartoony art, I love animation, I love comics, I love picture book art. I do often try to work a lot of realism into my work as well, in how I handle colors and how I depict things. And like, to me, that's kind of like the Ghibli, Studio Ghibli magic, where you'll have a cartoony art style that's very expressive and very evocative, but there's a lot of realistic, naturalistic elements in there as well. And it kind of gives it this very nostalgic but real feeling. And that's something that I'm always kind of striving for with my art. Now, if you are coloring along, please feel free to handle this however you wish to handle it. However you feel inspired to do it. I would love to see your art, regardless of whether you do it just copying what I'm doing straightforward 1, 2, 3, or if you're doing your own spin on it. So please consider tagging me at NettoSoup so I can see what you're working on. So I am working in my Canson XL watercolor sketchbook. That's what I use for all of my start to finish sketching, inking, and watercolor tutorials. This is a very affordable and accessible watercolor book that utilizes a cellulose, so that would be a wood pulp paper. Now, this differs from my regular watercolor illustrations in a lot of ways. While I love doing more cartoony, more simplistic pieces like this, I also enjoy doing more illustrative pieces on cotton rag paper, and both have just different ways of handling it. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but right now that my bark in the background has had a chance to dry out completely, I am using some removable masking fluid to mask off the hills in the bark so that we can then paint the valleys in the bark, or the areas that are more recessed into the bark. So a cellulose watercolor paper handles very differently from a cotton rag watercolor paper. I have tutorials where I talk about that in depth. I explain the differences and I explain what you can do to get the best out of your cheaper watercolor papers like this. Of the cellulose papers, Canson XL is one of my favorite accessible cheap papers. It's the one that I recommend, but it does handle differently from a cotton rag, and I do think it's disingenuous to call cellulose papers student grade and to call cotton rag papers professional grade simply based on the price point, because they just have different uses and they handle very differently. So when my masking fluid dried, I'm going in with a darker, more saturated mix of brown. This would be Van Dyke brown and maybe a little Amaldazone brown and some sepia brown to start painting in the shadows on the bark. And the masking fluid allows us to do this much more quickly and to utilize wet into wet techniques to get some variation in the color. So typically with cellulose papers, your watercolor pigments will sit on the surface of the paper. They never truly soak in. So your colors may not be as saturated. They may not be as vibrant. You may not be able to do as many layers. They may be more prone to lifting or turning to mud on the paper if you overwork them. You may not be able to do really soft, subtle glazes without it lifting up the colors underneath and turning it to mud. So basically my advice for working with cellulose paper is to keep it simple, keep it saturated, and to go fairly bold with it. And that's kind of what my start to finish watercolor series really leans into. And that's what I'm going to be doing today. And I apologize that I am taking up so much space in between you and the paper. My eyesight is atrocious, and I used to really try and keep in mind where the camera was at and where my head was at and try to work around the camera for YouTube. And then I realized that I was perpetuating practices that are just not really sustainable and don't really make for good art. And I decided to just do what I needed to do to make the piece look good and for me to be satisfied with it. And that way, at least I'm passing on some, more practicable skills than, dancing around the camera. So since this is in an oak tree, I wanted the door to be oak. So I looked up what oak wood looks like. And it does come in a variety of colors, but I decided to go with this lighter sort of oak. And that way we would get some more contrast going on in this illustration. So I'm starting out with a fairly thin mix of burnt sienna with a little bit of yellow ochre mixed in. And I'm starting to also add in the wood grain pattern. And at this point, I decided that I wanted the bottom half of the door to be a little bit darker than the top, and that way you could tell that it was actually two parts of the same door. You'll also notice that there's actually more slats on the bottom half of the door than on the top half of the door. That was done on purpose to again perpetuate that this is two halves of the same door. So I decided to go in, I'm going in with a little bit more saturated burnt sienna, which is a beautiful sort of translucent brown color. And this is, I'm adding it just to the bottom of the door in total to kind of try and differentiate the two halves of the door. But I'm also going to use this to start making the wood grain pattern on the top half of the door a little bit more pronounced. While that's drying, I'm going to get started on our pine cone Christmas tree. I've already masked out the red beads on the tree, and now I'm going to start painting the pine cone itself, and I'm using a warm brown for this. I used a little bit of paper towel to lift out some of the brown from one of the acorns that I accidentally painted. I'll be masking those out later to make it a little bit easier for me. But I'm using burnt umber, I believe, for this. And then while it's still wet, I'm dabbing in some more undersea green to kind of replicate the lichen that I noticed on the pine cone reference that I'm using. I really wanted to kind of bring that in since I like lichen and moss, and that also kind of ties it in with the oak tree as well. Even though, yes, I know pine cones are not produced by oak trees, that would be acorns. Again, this is inspired by my own oak trees and the squirrels who do silly things in my oak trees. So for the bottom half of the door, I added another layer. I added some shadows with burnt sienna, and I am continuing to kind of refine the wood grain pattern. Once that is dried, I'm going to start on the fir, F-I-R, wreath. And this was done a little bit more simplistically, but I am still referencing what fur looks like. And I am going for a cooler green for this wreath. And that's going to kind of contrast nicely against some of the warmer browns that we've got going on and kind of add to the bright wintry feel. I am painting the ribbon red. I believe I am starting with Holbein Cherry Red, which is a type of quinacridone red, and it has kind of this kind of candy color to it, almost like a strawberry sort of color. And you'll notice at the very top of the ribbon, I did leave the white paper highlight, but as we get lower on the ribbon, I've filled it in a little bit more. Now, once my pine cone has dried, I'm going to mask off my lichen using some masking fluid. While that dries, I'm going to use a round brush. And this is the same way I would paint animal fur, just doing really short little brush strokes that end in a point. And this is a more saturated mix of Hooker's green with a little bit of phthalo green. And I'm not trying to perfectly cover it at all. I want some of those highlights in there, and that's going to really help give the impression of fir needles. To help this illustration feel more considered and more full, I am actually going to paint in a little bit of the dirt, but I'm mostly just painting in kind of the shadow areas of the dirt using sepia. So basically where there was a cast shadow. So I live in the American South. I actually live in Louisiana right now. I grew up in Louisiana, but I spent a lot of time in Nashville where we would get snow. And one of the things that I observed is even when we get a pretty even blanket of snow, if it's a fresh snowfall, there's still going to be areas that were protected from the snowfall, like, in the shadow or the base of a tree. So that's what I'm kind of trying to replicate here. I am using a custom mixed Payne's gray for the windows. It actually has a little bit more blue to it to kind of reflect the blue of the sky. But I do think that if you wanted to do a stained glass window effect, that would be very cute. And I kind of wish I thought of that myself. I'm adding another layer to our ribbon using our cherry red, and I am making sure to leave a little bit of that highlight because I want this to look like a satin ribbon, and satin ribbons have a shine to them. They reflect the light due to the way the fabric has been woven. My masking fluid is dried, I'm doing another layer of our warmish brown all over the pine cone. And I did actually mask off the acorns so I can kind of paint with abandon. And I'm dabbing in some Van Dyke brown and a little bit of a Maldzone brown and some sepia so that we get this really beautiful mottled effect. And I feel like this works really well for more organic things like our pine cones and like our bark. It adds some visual interest. It keeps things from feeling too flat. And it's a very easy technique to do so long as you're comfortable with masking fluid. I like to use Winsor & Newton's removable, and the removable part is really important because they do make permanent masking fluids. I like to use Winsor & Newton's removable masking fluid with the yellow tint so I can see it against white paper. I apply it very thickly because I find it's a lot easier to remove from my paper without tearing the paper, and I also get better coverage. And then when I'm removing my masking fluid, I like to use a masking fluid frisket to help me remove the masking fluid. Once my pine cone has dried, I am actually applying masking fluid to the petals, the protrusions on the pine cone, so the little bits that are sticking out closest to the viewer. Sort of the same technique that I use for the bark. And this is going to allow me to very quickly and easily paint the shadowy areas of the pine cone without having to work around all of those little islands. I give my watercolors a spritz with clean water because this is actually dried out overnight and I'm coming back to it the next day. So, you know, with nice, refreshed, rested body and brain. And I'm adding in some shadows to our ribbon using alizarin crimson. So I am working a little bit darker and a little bit cooler and a little bit more saturated. For the majority of this illustration, I am using silver black velvet round watercolor brushes. This is a mixed fiber brush. I am looking for alternatives to silver black velvet because I find that I need a snappier brush and something that can really hold a point better and get into those details a little bit better. I've had these brushes though for about 10 years, so it might just be time to start buying some new ones. I paint almost every day, so they certainly have gotten a lot of use. And then when I am applying my masking fluid, I'm using a synthetic watercolor brush that I've worked some brush soap into before I apply the masking fluid. And this helps keep the masking fluid from getting sucked up into the metal ferrule and ruining the brush. I'm adding in another layer of our burnt sienna to the bottom half of the door. You can do whatever color you want for the door. I went with a natural oak tone to kind of keep the oak theme going, and also because with last year's Christmas start to finish illustration or winter holiday start to finish illustration, I did a red door and I didn't want to do a green door here, but you can do whatever color you want. I'm just going with kind of a lighter wood so that we can talk about wood grain and painting wood grain, and also because it adds that little bit of lighter color contrast, you know, as compared to the green of the wreath and the red of the wreath. Painting, I am both looking at my reference, but I'm also always kind of looking for contrast. I'm looking for saturation. I'm looking at what needs to be darker. And in this instance, I decided that the white snow needs a heavier shadow on it. Now, if this feels too dark for you, don't worry. We can adjust this. Watercolor is, once you're familiar with watercolor is extremely forgiving, and it's honestly very easy to work with, I find. I have noticed though that people who are good with acrylics, so people who are good with opaque material where you can always go back and add highlights and you're not necessarily working with the white of the paper, they tend to struggle with watercolor. And then people who are good with transparent medium like watercolor tend to struggle with gouache and acrylics. So it may just be that we think about handling paint and color and layering differently, but I really like watercolor and I find it very easy to work with. I am adding in my darker shadow to the pine cone now that I've got the petals all masked off. And then I'm going in with a more saturated version of Van Dyke Brown and Sepia Brown to start adding in those shadows. And that will kind of mix wet into wet. And it's going to give it a little bit more of a natural sort of feeling. But anyway, when it comes to watercolor, you have a lot of options for kind of adjusting things and forgiving things. You can always bring in some gouache. You can always bring in some watercolor pencils, especially if you're not interested in like strict traditional watercolor, which y'all, I paint watercolor comics. I do not care what like the Watercolor Society thinks of me or my work. I don't exist to them anyway. So I'm always down to bring in watercolor pencils or watercolor markers or gouache to make the kind of adjustments that I want to see and that will make my art shine. Because in the end, it doesn't matter what the purists say. It matters if you like the piece and if it accomplishes what you're looking for to accomplish. And I wanted to accomplish a little bit more contrast in the ribbon, so I'm bringing in a little bit of naphthalene maroon to start painting in some of the shadows on that ribbon, and so that we can get a little bit more of that kind of light and that saturation going on. Now, one thing that I find that many cellulose papers kind of struggle with depicting is saturation. And I find that it's really best to keep things very simple when it comes to watercolor papers. Right now, I'm using a masking fluid frisket. I bought this at Dollar Tree for like $1.25, so it doesn't cost a whole lot, to safely and easily remove my masking frisket from the paper. Some people can use their hands. My hands are way too dry for it to work. Thanks, Sjogrens. So I find that a masking fluid frisket is just so much easier. It is a very inexpensive investment, so if you struggle with using masking fluid, if you find that your masking fluid tears your paper all the time, you might want to try a masking fluid frisket. You can also find it in the model section of places like Michael's. So I will have all my materials listed out for you guys down in the description below if you want to shop with me, or if you're looking to see if you have something similar in your stash already, or if you're just looking for some ideas. Whichever way you decide to go makes me happy. So now that the tree has dried and I've removed the frisket, I'm going in with a really wet thin wash of like a brownish gray. I'm actually painting back over the areas that I had done, like the shadow area of the bark, the more recessed areas of the bark. I'm kind of getting that to melt into the paints. And I am still leaving some islands of like the highlight color visible, but I'm kind of marrying the colors a little bit better. Again, I'm really working from photo reference. I'm looking at what the bark looks like and I'm trying to replicate it, not one-to-one. I'm not going for realism. I'm a cartoony artist, but I am trying to capture some of that. I'm trying to be evocative with how I'm handling it. While it is still wet, I am also going in and dabbing in some Van Dyke brown and some sepia brown and allowing that to kind of bloom and blossom and give us those mottled colors. Right about now, I am so sad that my phone ate that first recording, because the first recording was really good and I really liked it, and I'm trying to like recapture some of that, but I'm tired, y'all. So I apologize. I do have other tutorials on drawing, on inking, and on watercolor. I have more start to finish tutorials. I also have, if you're interested in getting started with watercolor, my watercolor crash course and my watercolor 101 playlist that I hope you guys will check out, because as I said, it is my goal to make art more accessible to more people. And I love traditional media. Not that I don't use digital, because I definitely do, but I love traditional media. I think it is so much fun. I love playing with art supplies, and I want to make that more accessible to more people. And that's one of the reasons why I review a variety of price points when it comes to art supplies, from Canson XL and Praying watercolors to professional grade papers and paints, because I want to make art something that can be part of your daily life, that isn't priced out of your reach, and that you can make a part of your life, whether you want to do it for a profession, whether you want to do it as a hobby, whether you just enjoy doing it for fun. I want you to have art as part of your life. Once my pine cone and the surrounding areas have dried, I can remove the masking fluid from the acorns, and I am referencing acorns for this, and I found some that are this beautiful gold to orange to brown sort of ombre shading. I'm also removing the masking fluid from my bells, because I'm almost at the point where I can start painting the bells. And with watercolor, a lot of it is order of operations. So, and how you choose to handle that may be very personal and up to you. I'm not here to tell you there's one right way to do it. There's just the way I like to do it. So I'm adding in a little bit more undersea green to the petals on the pine cone, or just kind of adjusting the colors somewhat, just to kind of reflect what I'm seeing in the reference and to give it a little bit more contrast. And I'm so sorry that my head is blocking your view. It is what it is. My eyesight is atrocious, so please do bear with me. For the acorns, I am starting with a Quin Gold. Now, Quin Gold is kind of a discontinued color. There's a lot of companies that are trying to replicate the pigment, but Toyota has made that pigment color not available. If you guys don't know, art actually gets most of their pigments from the automotive market. So I'm a little worried now that I'm seeing that all cars are red, blue, gray, white, silver, and black, because I'm really concerned about the art markets access to pigments if we're just going to go with boring colors for cars. So Queen Gold is no longer really available, but you could kind of mix something similar using Indian Yellow with a little bit of burnt sienna. I also dabbed in some, I think it is like Aussie Red Gold from Daniel Smith, but you could also use like a quinacridone burnt sienna or a quinacridone orange to get that really kind of bright poppy, brassy sort of orange color. And I'm going to add in further details once that's had a chance to dry. For the acorn tops, I am going with yellow ochre, and then I'm going to dab in a little bit of maybe like raw sienna or raw umber, or you could even do some burnt sienna for that as well. For the mistletoe, I do want to kind of do some color contrast because referencing mistletoe, it's kind of like this bright bluey greeny color, but I'm going to lean more into the bright and the yellow aspects so it kind of pops against our fir wreath. I waited until I had the base colors down to decide on what color I wanted to paint the presents and the bells, because I wanted to make sure that I had good contrast, since this is a very straightforward kind of boring composition. There's not a lot going on, but that kind of adds to like this peaceful, bright morning where you might wake up to find a present on your doorstep. So it's fine that the composition is kind of straightforward and kind of quiet because that's what I'm going for here. But I wanted to make sure that since it's supposed to be a bright winter morning, one of those bright, crisp winter mornings that makes you excited to be alive, unless you have joint pains and then you can't leave your bed, like me. Anyway, take it back to childhood. Bright, happy winter mornings. So I wanted the colors to be bright and vibrant and saturated and really pop and to feel crisp and alive, like the morning is full of potential. It's one of the things I like about cartoony art over just straightforward realistic art is you really have a lot of opportunity for storytelling. So the little angel at the top of the tree is supposed to be one of those wooden ornaments. Like those were like, okay, so I was born in 1986. I'm 39 years old, about to be 40 this year. And these little wooden ornaments were kind of a popular thing for miniature trees. I don't know if there's still such a thing, but I thought it was like the perfect tree topper for a tiny person or for a little mouse to decorate their pinecone Christmas tree with. If you are painting along or if you're coloring along, however you choose to do this, I just want to remind you that you do not have to use the same colors that I'm using. You can change this up however you want. You can personalize it. You can make it your own. I also want to remind you guys that I will have a link to the line art down in the description below. It is hosted on my Patreon, but it is free to the public. If you want to just print it out and color along with me, that's my little holiday gift to you guys and to help you guys make art a little bit more accessible if you're off for winter break. So for the mistletoe, I started with a bright yellow green, and I am layering on a little bit of that same bright yellow green mixed with a little bit of phthalo blue so we can start building up those colors. I really do want it to contrast with the other colors that are going on so it's visible that there's a little bit of mistletoe hanging from the front door. The package is going to be gold with a red bow, and the little angel on top of the tree is gold with an ultramarine blue dress. And often when I am depicting religious iconography, I like to use ultramarine blue because it's kind of a reference to the medieval use of ultramarine blue with the Virgin Mary. Back then, ultramarine blue was derived from this very, very pure blue lapis lazuli that was only found in like a specific set of caves in I believe it's Iraq now. Now we have synthetic ultramarine blue, so it's a really easy to really affordable, easy to come by color. But back in the Middle Ages, it was extremely rare and precious, and thus it was primarily used when painting figures of reverence, so like the Virgin Mary. And that's why I like to use ultramarine blue to kind of refer to that iconography. So that's why I'm using ultramarine blue for the angel. Also, it just kind of pops against the brown of the oak tree. So once I finish painting the bells and the ribbon, I'm going in and I'm adding in the shadow for the fur wreath using a smaller round brush. And I am going cooler and slightly darker with our shadows. And I'm also making sure to paint the fir needles on top of the ribbon and on top of the bells as well. This is going to give us more of a sense of depth. Not aiming for super realistic with the fur wreath. I don't want it to add too much visual clutter or detract from some of the more important elements of this illustration, but I am adding in another layer of shadow, this time with a smaller round than what we were using previously, and indigo paint to add in kind of those darkish shadows on the fur wreath. At this point, all of our base colors have been painted, so it's kind of up to you how much shadow you want to work in, how much detail you want to work in. You can decide that this is good enough. You can decide to push it even further. One thing though about cellulose is it's not as forgiving to overworking as a cotton rag paper is, so I would really recommend just in general kind of keeping things simple, keeping your techniques simple, and really just trying to work with more saturated color at this point rather than trying to do glazes. At this point, I've pulled out the white gouache and I'm going to use this to add in some rim light and some highlights. We're going to be working between white gouache, watercolor, and black ink. But for right now, I want to use this to pop some highlights on the fur. And this is going to kind of help me decide, how much contrast I want to add, where I want to re-ink. I'm also going to use this to add some snow on top of certain elements. So like add snow to the snow, add snow to the pebble walkway, add snow to the fir wreath, add snow to the bark, that sort of thing. Rather than having drawn it in from the get-go and then trying to mask around it, I actually find it easier to paint it in using white gouache and then to add a little bit of ultramarine blue to kind of marry it into the illustration. And this is one of the reasons I say watercolor can be, if you know your order of operations and you're familiar with your materials, it can be a really, really forgiving medium to work with. You can see I ended up adding in a lot of snow. How much you want to add is up to you. You might want just a little, you might want a lot. I wanted it to kind of look like a fresh falling of snow. And then I'm going to kind of marry the snow into the illustration by adding an ink border to it. I'm also going to go back and re-ink some areas where we've lost our definition or we've lost our contrast, or areas that might need that kind of sharper, cleaner line to make it easier to tell what's going on. This is entirely optional. You do not have to re-ink if you don't want to. I've reinked, I'm going to go back in with a little bit more white gouache to add more highlights. And that way I can add the white also on top of the fresh black inks, and that'll kind of give it a more highlight effect. It's a little hard to explain. It's just my work process. You don't have to do it this way. I'm also going to go in and add in more ultramarine blue to the areas that we had gouached, just to kind of marry that snow more into the finished illustration. We are almost done. The only thing I want to do is show you guys what it looks like now. Look how cute this is. Again, you'll have the line art down in the description as well as the materials. And then I want to do the effect of snow falling. So I'm going to do a splatter technique with white gouache on my brush, and I'm just going to gently hammer it, and it's going to give us this kind of splattering of snow falling, and that's going to give us the effect of snow actively falling in this illustration. Thank you guys so much for joining me with this start to finish tutorial. If you're looking for more paint alongs, please check the description below. I will have all the resources you need to help you make art a habit. This kind of tutorial, all of my tutorials are made possible thanks to my amazing patrons over on Patreon. You can join their hallowed ranks for just $2 a month. Their support enables me to be able to buy the supplies that I review here for the channel, to share the materials that I create here on the channel, and to make tutorials. So if you believe in art and you want to help support the creation of art, whether you make art yourself or not, you can join them at patreon.com/nattosoup. Merry Christmas and happy holiday, guys. Bye.